Hey, this is Joe Hartman with interoperative neuromonitoring.com. I also work at Sentient Medical. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Services in the South. And welcome to the CNIM crash course. Before we get into it and get going to see exactly what's in it, I want to tell you what's not in it. This, like the title says, is a crash course, so it should not be seen as the end-all be-all. So please be studying your other material. Hopefully you've been studying coming into this. This should just be used as an additive to what you plan on studying for the CNIM. All right, so let's get started. You might be familiar with this guy. I use him on my website all the time. He is the experienced surgical neurophysiologist, and he says, let's talk about SSEPs we're running for the upper extremity. We'll start from the beginning at the stimulation and end at the last recordable area. So on the CNIM, SSEPs makes up a large portion of the test. It's the modality that we probably use most across the country, and so it's something you're going to be heavily tested on. You should have a good understanding of the anatomy and physiology that entails delivering an electrical potential to the nerve and recording a response. So when we break it down to the very beginning parts of things, we have two types of cells. We have neurons and neuroglia. The neurons is the information processing cells. They conduct action potentials. They enable thinking, sensing, neurocontrol muscles, and glands. The neuroglia is the supporting cells. They nourish the neurons and they protect the neurons structurally. Important neuroglia types that we should be familiar with is first astrocytomas, or I'm sorry, that's the tumor, astrocytes. They establish and maintain proper chemical environment around neurons. They nourish the neurons and assist in neuronal migration, and it's an essential part of the blood-brain barrier. So if we look down at the pictures here, this black one here, we have the neuron with the cell body. Here's the dendrites, here's the axon, and then we have these astrocytes surrounding the synaptic area here. The next one is microglia. These are phagocytotic immune cells of the central nervous system. They help to fend off the CNS from invading microbes and are able to take up and digest bacteria via processes called phagocytosis. So this is kind of our central nervous system protectors. So if we have offending viruses, bacterias, dead cells or debris after ischemic events, for damaged cells or damaged neuronal degeneration, these microglia will go in there and kind of engulf it and take out the trash is pretty much what they do. The third is the oligodendrocytes. These are important for formation of supporting networks around the CNS. So if we come to our picture here, we have a bunch of axons surrounded by the Schwann cells, and we have our node of Ranvier. We'll get into this in a little bit. And the supporting structure of the nucleus of the oligodendrocyte. So it's doing exactly what it's intended to do, is to help maintain that structure. The last, and probably the one out of these that would be most likely found on the CNM, is the ependymal cells. These are cell types which lines the ventricles of the brain. They form this cerebrospinal fluid and assist in circulation of it. So we have here the spinal cord, here we have the ependymal cells, and then we have the CSF fluid that helps nourish all those neuronal tissues. Now that was neuroglia. This is the neurons itself. For all basic purposes, it has three parts. The first and easiest to identify is the cell body. That contains the nucleus, which is in the central here. This cell body is also called the soma. This activates synthesis of proteins and neurotransmitters there. There's a whole lot that you can go into with the ribosomes and all that kind of stuff and how the cell survives. I don't think you probably need to know it in that detail for the CNIM. The dendrites receive nerve signal inputs from other neurons and other dendrites and move it towards the cell. So we can see the arrows here. The dendrites, these are kind of your antennas. It's the one that's picking up all the information to be brought to the cell body, to be processed, and then to be shipped back out through the next area, which is the axon. And the axon is a long, elongated cell process which conducts the nerve impulses or action potentials to another neuron. Remember, axons away. So this is, as the arrows show, flowing outward towards the end of the axon itself, which has the axon terminal, and then we'll get into that later, how that neural signal is transmitted. So again, here's another picture. Notice the layers of the nerve. This is how each axon makes up the nerve to conduct the afferent and efferent messages. Afferent means information going towards the central nervous system. Efferent is going away from it. So again, we have the dendrites here. They are little antennas coming to our soma or cell body, which has its eccentrically located nucleus. The beginning of the axon is called the axon hillock. This is where the propagation of the action potential begins as it comes down the axon itself. The axon impulse generating and conducting region. This is the Schwann cells here. This is the direction of the impulse. Each Schwann cell is interrupted by this little node around Veer. When the action potential goes across the axon, we'll see a little bit later, but it jumps across from node to node. This makes transmission of the information quicker. And then we have the axon terminals, where it releases its neurotransmitters. Possibly you could see the different type of neurons, the bipolar interneuron, the unipolar sensory neuron, the multipolar neuron, and the pyramidal cells. So this is something we might see up in the dorsal root ganglion. This is something we might see up in the brain for that controls motor. The central nervous system can be broken down into two distinct areas. One is the white matter. This is the nervous tissue consisting of myelinated and unmyelinated axons of many neurons. A lot of the white matter of the CNS consists of tracts, or it's a bundle of axons running up and down the spinal cord. So white matter is your highway. This is the one that's transmitting information to and from the areas, either where it originates or to where it's going to end up. The gray matter is nervous tissue containing neuronal cell bodies, dendrites, unmyelinated axons, and neuroglia. This is your processing area. This is what is found in your spinal cord, where it helps regulate things through Renshaw cells and other postsynaptic inhibitory effects to make sure that everything is regulated. The same thing goes on in your brain. Of course, your brain also has higher functioning like cognition, memory, things of that nature. Okay, 4 terms here that you have to know for the test. You'll probably get at least one question on something on this page, and it's real easy to memorize, so it's once it makes sense to you. So afferent versus efferent, orthodromic versus antidromic. If we start here, we look at somatic senses, special senses, and visceral. So this is just motor or touch. This is special like hearing or taste, and visceral. This is like the vague information coming from your organs. Afferent information is going towards the central nervous system, so you think afferent input. Here is our central nervous system, which is made up of our brain and spinal cord. After it processes things, it ships it back out for the output, or efferent, and it goes to our somatic areas, which would be like our muscles, or our autonomic, fight or flight, sympathetic or parasympathetic. So if we have afferent going towards, that's our sensory input that's going towards our central nervous system. If you have something going along an axon that's in sensory axon and it's going towards the central nervous system, it's called an orthodromic transmission of it. If it's the reverse, so if you have sensory information coming up a motor axon going centrally to the central nervous system, then that is antidromic transmission of the information. the reverse is the same, or reverse is the opposite. So if we have a motor output or a motor transmission going on a sensory axon, then that is also antidromic. So if it's going the wrong way, it's antidromic. So if a motor is going this way, or if a sensory is going this way, those are both antidromic. Now that you know the anatomical structures, let's talk about the physiological process of creating a potential that transmits from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Selective transducers. We're talking about receptors here. So receptors that convert the energy contained in the stimulus into another form of energy, specifically into some sort of membrane potential. Receptors are termed selective because each type of receptor is highly specific or selective with respect to the type of stimulus it responds to. So if you take a feather and you stroke your foot, that's a light sensation. It goes up through that receptor that is responsible for grading that potential of a light stroke. Same thing with your receptors on your eyeballs. They're there to take in the light and the colors and to give you vision. And they all are pretty good at doing just that. There is a little bit of overlap. One example I gave here is if you close your eyelid and then put pressure on your eyeball, you'll start to see white lights. You're having this visual experience, even though it's from a pressure or mechanical stimulation, when the receptors that are causing it shouldn't be able to cause that experience. So there is a little bit of overlap, but for the most part, each receptor is pretty specific to what it's supposed to grade. The energy contained in the stimulus is used to change the conductance of the membrane for one or more ion. So I keep using this word graded. So the energy contained, it kind of depends on how much pressure or how much light, and it will grade that input and then give an appropriate release of neurotransmitter to kind of let our central nervous system understand the amount of information that's coming back. The conductance changes will cause the receptor membrane potential to change itself. So in neuromonitoring, we use electrical current to stimulate the nerves for SSEP, but that's not how our nerves typically work. They use those selective transducers to convert the energy of the external or internal stimuli into an electrical potential. So when we're running SSEP, we bypass the receptors. It goes straight to summating or stimulating the axons itself, and then it just travels up that same pathway. But we should still know the receptors for the CNIM. So if we look at these different mechanoreceptors, different receptors of the skin transmit different sensation. The light touch and pressure are more myelinated and therefore have greater conduction speed. Pain and temperature have slower conduction speed because they're less myelinated fibers. These receptors are probably stimulated when we perform SSEPs, but not needed because of the direct nerve stimulation or the direct stimulation on the axon itself. Whether a neuron is stimulated by a receptor or another neuron or artificially by an electric current, the resulting action potential will be the same. So I like this picture here. It shows the different kind of stimulus that can be coming in, either temperature or a light touch or some kind of pain or some kind of pressure sense. And here we see the different kind of receptors as well. I don't think it will ever show you a receptor and say, is this a nociceptor or a Pacinian corpuscle? But it might give you which receptor is responsible for grading a pressure, and you say, oh, it's Pacinian corpuscle. The next piece of this is coming down where we look at the fiber size associated with each of these receptors. So like we said before, these nociceptors are transmitted on very unmyelinated nerves, so it has a very slow propagation. And so we see here that they've labeled this in different groups, and these diameter sizes line up with conduction velocity. And I'll show you a nice little equation here in a second to help figure all these things out so you don't have to memorize this whole chart, even though it is good to know going into the test. The SSEPs, This is the number that the range that you should use if you have any kind of calculation asking about SSEP's speed of transmission. It's somewhere in this type A group 2 conduction velocity of 40 to 70, where something like the auditory system is slower. That's probably closer to about 20 meters per second. Okay, so now we're going to start at the familiar, but not at the beginning. This is something that you probably have had back in college in any kind of physiology class that you've ever taken. For a neuron at rest, there is a high concentration of sodium and chlorine ions in the extracellular fluid compared to the intracellular fluid, where there is a high concentration of potassium ions and proteins in the intracellular fluid compared to the extracellular fluid. So we have our positive sodiums and our negative chlorides on the outside at resting area. We also have our positive sodium on the inside and these very highly negative proteins as well inside. It's that negative charge or those negative proteins that gives the resting membrane a internal negative overall negative charge. So here we are, keeps a resting membrane, a resting potential negative of 70 microvolts. So that's kind of the general number that's given out there. It can fluctuate obviously up and down depending on a lot of different factors. But for most textbooks or testing situation, minus 70 is kind of the repeating value that's given. A sufficiently strong depolarization causes the voltage sensitive sodium channels to open. The increasing permeability increases the positivity of the inner cell or the sodium equilibrium. And this is a good picture here, but I believe the next one, yes, it has a little bit better detail. Okay, so in the number 1 here, we're in the resting state. The activation gates on the sodium and potassium channels are closed and the membrane resting potential is maintained. Here we have depolarization from a stimulus opens the activation gates on some sodium channels. Sodium influx through those channels depolarizes the membrane. If the depolarization reaches the threshold, it triggers an action potential. So picture 1 here, we are at the resting membrane potential of minus 70, and it's even Steven. We get some kind of depolarization, and now we start having sodium rushing into the cell, becoming more positive, or going from negative 70 closer up towards that negative 50. If it stopped here, then nothing would happen. If we hit this threshold area, then we reach number 3. 3 is the rising phase of the action potential. Depolarization opens the activation gates on most sodium channels, while potassium channel activation gates remain closed. Sodium influx makes the inside of the membrane positive with respect to the outside. So now we have this large influx of sodium coming in. Potassium is not allowed to be released, and we have this highly positive membrane or positive charge inside now. Once it reaches a certain point, it will start to activate our potassium channels to open up. So the inactivation gates on the most sodium channels close, blocking sodium influx, so no more sodium allowed in. The activation gates on most potassium channels open, permitting potassium efflux, which again makes the inside of the cell more negative. So here we have our repolarization phase, number 4 here, and we get to number 5, which is the hyperpolarization phase, or the undershoot. Both gates of the sodium channels are closed, but the activation gates on some potassium channels are still open. As these gates close on most potassium channels, the inactivation gates open on sodium channels. The membrane returns to its resting state. So this is kind of background information, and we will get to where it is clinically useful when we start looking at things like motor evoked potentials, or even other things like the blink reflex or bulbar cavernous reflex, or even SSEPs. And if you've read some of my stuff on the blog, you might already know where I'm going with some of that. Conduction of the action potential in a neuron. So first, the action potential is initiated in the axon hillock, right here, just after the cell body. Conduction of action potential by local current flow down the axon. So we have this inside negative charge, like we just went over, outside positive charge. We have these sodium rushing in, potassium's not allowed out. Now we start to become more positive inside. As this one becomes more positive, it influences the negative charge on the neighboring area, which is same as these here. So we will go both directions. Let's see, where was I? 3. Resting potential is an adjacent inactive area, is depolarized to threshold by local current flow in active area. So that's what I just went over before. 4, the first action potential triggers next one in the adjacent area. This is a self-perpetuating cycle down the neuron. So site A is started from the axon hillock, goes to site B, goes to site D, goes to site D. Once it moves past this state of being overly positive on the inside, it will now overshoot like we saw in that last picture, and it's in this refractory state. And we'll get into why this is an important state to be aware of when we're setting our program parameters, this refractory state. So this action potential, for me, it's easiest to think about it when you compare it to flushing a toilet. So action potentials abide by the all or none law. Once an action potential starts, it will conduct down the whole neuron once you flush. So if it happens, it's going to happen down that whole neuron. Just like when you pull on the handle on the toilet and you flush it, it's going to swirl all the water down. It's going to suck it all down the drain. Refractory period is required to keep action potentials from bouncing back and forth in a neuron. First portion of that refractory period is called the absolute refractory period. Sodium gates are closed and inactivated. No action potential can occur at that time. So back to the toilet, you flushed it, it sucked all the water down. We're now in the refractory period. The bowl starts to fill up again on the top, and if you click your little hammer on the side there, your little tab, it's not going to flush again. We're in the absolutely refractory period. After that becomes the relative refractory period. The action potential can occur, but stimulus must be larger than normal to get started. Potassium gates are inactivated during this time. So we've had this overshoot or this hyperpolarization, and now we're in this relative refractory period. Actually, it happens a little bit before that even happens, when it's still on its downslope on that action potential diagram. And here's where the bowls fill up enough, and you click the little side handle, and then you can get a second flush, but sometimes you just got to hold it or flush it a little harder, make sure the lid is all the way open in order to get it. The refractory period is similar to the inability to flush a toilet twice in a row. I already said that. Ensures unidirectional movement of the action potential and sets an upper limit to the frequency of occurrence of the action potentials. So in this first sentence here where I say the action potential keeps it from bouncing back and forth, once this action potential moves to this next area, the area behind it is now in this absolute refractory period where it will not allow a second one to happen. But out in front of it, it isn't that in that state yet, so it will allow the action potential to move down this way while the next section becomes the refractory period, disallowing it to go back towards the cell body. So it's the axon we're conducting along. The axon, an axon that has very little or no Schwann cell around it or myelin sheath around it is a contiguous or continuous conduction of an unmyelinated axon. So it just propagates down the axon itself. Where if you do have this myelin sheath around it, it now jumps across this sheath because we'll go into the reason why it happens, but it increases the speed of conduction. So the more myelinated the nerve is, the larger this axon internal area is, the less resistance it has, and the faster it will propagate across this axon. So it's the myelin that helps speed things up, and action potentials are propagated. Potentials created in receptors are not action potentials, but rather graded potentials. They can, however, cause action potentials. So like I said, if you're taking a pinprick and you just gently touch it on your skin, you're like, wow, that's sharp, it kind of hurts. But if you start pushing more pressure on it, all of a sudden it's very painful. None of that is an action potential itself, it's just the receptor cells grading that response. However, if that response becomes great enough to where that pinprick is just laying on your skin, you don't even notice it, maybe it didn't fire off any nociceptors. If you push a little bit further, now those graded responses are firing at a higher frequency. All of a sudden you have an action potential along those nociceptors up to the axons, and then you experience pain because of your central processing. So not all potentials are non-graded. The action potential itself, if we're looking here, we have a stimulus that reaches a threshold, and we have this all or none potential. We increase our stimulus, all or none potential, but that does not change. If we increase it even more, still not the same. So these are potentials that are not grading at all, just having an all or none response. Here we look at the receptors. We have a small stimulus, we have a small graded response, a larger, 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 larger. A stimulus will produce open channels at the receptor, resulting in an inward flux of sodium and depolarization, and that's for a receptor potential. A receptor potential is a type of graded potential. The stronger the stimulus, the greater the graded potential. Receptor potentials also have no refractory period, so sustained output is possible. Movement of a graded potential. Spread of a graded potential is known by a process called passive flow. The gated channels open and positive charges enter the cell. This initial temporary area of depolarization, or the membrane potential becomes less negative, is called the active area. The positive charge moves along the membrane to the areas that are less positive, so it can go in either direction. This newly negative region outside the cell, along it but not across it, the membrane to the less negative areas. This movement of charge is called current. So we see the spread of depolarization going in both directions in these graded receptor potentials. So we've had a lot of differences between the graded potentials and action potentials. It's pretty good to understand the difference between two because you'll probably see a handful of questions. This is a time where it's just rote memorization, and instead of going over this and reading it all out loud, I would advise you to pause the video right now and then take a look and get your pen out and write some notes on it. Okay, so you had time to pause the video. Let's go on to the next one. Afferent neurons. The stronger the stimulus, the larger the graded receptor potential. The more frequent the action potential of afferent neurons, you cannot get a larger action potential, the more neurotransmitter is released at the next synapse. And also, stronger stimulus usually affects larger areas, so it incorporates more receptors. So here we're looking at our action potentials that obey the all or none. So how can the brain determine the strength of stimulus? The sensory neurons transform physical stimulus like mechanical into electrical activity. Each element produces a characteristic signal. So here we have an amplitude and duration of our response, which is a muscle. We're looking at a muscle spindle, so we're looking at a stretch. That's the response that's going to grade for our central nervous system to process. So we have a standard amplitude and duration. We have our standard response here at our standard frequency, and we have neurotransmitter that is released at the synaptic terminal onto some other end organ. If we increase the amplitude or we stretch a little bit harder, we have a larger graded response, which has a higher frequency at our threshold and causes a larger release of neurotransmitter. If we have it harder and longer, we have this larger, greater response for a longer duration of time. We have this higher frequency, which does have some kind of tapering at the end as our body becomes acclimated to things. Just like if you have the pinprick and it's pressing down, it hurts like hell in the beginning, and it still hurts, but maybe not as bad shortly after. And we have a large area of neurotransmitter released. The frequency of action potentials is determined by the strength of the stimulus. The absolute refractory period limits the maximum number of action potentials generated per unit time by the axon. The strength of the stimulus must be very high in order to ensure that the duration of the action potential is as short as the duration of the absolute refractory period. And I'll get to that in a second. The stronger the normal stimulus is required to overcome the relative refractory period. Okay, so here we have an action potential at resting membrane potential. At moment 0, we have some kind of depolarization. At, call it 0.2 milliseconds, we have it reaching threshold. We have this all or none response. And up until this point here, we are in the, from here to here, we're in the absolute refractory period where no other stimulus can cause a second action potential. But once we get to this certain point in the yellow, we are now in the relative refractory period where it's going to hyperpolarize and we have all this sodium rushing out of the cell, becoming more negative. If we hit it with a very similar response that just barely brought it to threshold the first time, we will not have a second response. But if we give it a sustained stimulus or a higher intensity stimulus, it might be able to cause a second action potential while it is still in this relative refractory period. And we can see here is we're still coming out of the absolute refractory period into the relative refractory period, and we have a second stimulus that is, meets threshold. If we try to do it too quick, it would never cause a response. So if we look at this time frame here, it goes all the way up to 5 milliseconds, but we know we gotta stay within 1. And this is kind of a generalized picture here. But when we think of our inner stimulus interval that we use for motor evoked potentials, the literature states that 2 to 4 milliseconds, dependent upon the intensity used, as well as other things like the impedance of the potential or the electrical stimulation itself, is the sweet spot for having a multi-pulsed MEP. If we had an inner stimulus interval of 0.5, say, we'd be hitting our second train here in our absolute refractory period. We would not be able to summate the same motor units that we did with the first train. And that defeats the whole purpose of having multiple trains in our MEPs. We're trying to overcome this anesthetic effect by summating multiple groups of motor neurons, one after another. The ones that we don't stimulate with one train, we hope we're bringing it close enough to threshold, if it didn't fire, that the next one will hit it and cause it to cause an action potential. So we're making use of both temporal and spatial summation in order to elicit a response from the greatest amount of neurons in order to most likely achieve the most optimal motor response we possibly could. So that's where this all comes into use. And they're doing similar things with bulbar cavernous reflex. You can see that in one of my blog posts. They're looking at it for SSEP stimulation, blink reflex, everything, H reflex, all these things that we used to think had no chance. We're now kind of taking a second look at it because we're utilizing this multi-pulse stimulation and adhering to the absolute and relative refractory periods. That's within our understanding now. So this is an oversimplification of neurotransmitters, calling them either excitatory or inhibitory. If we have any scientists, neuroscientists watching this right now, they're going to be shaking their head. But for the purposes of the CNIM, we are going to call glutamate an excitatory neurotransmitter. We're going to call GABA an inhibitory, and we're going to call acetylcholine able to do both. So if we look at the specific kind of neurotransmitter, if we have an excitatory one that synapses on the cells, it opens the gates, the sodium rushes in, becomes more positive, it goes closer to the threshold, we might have a chance for an action potential. If we have these inhibitory neurotransmitter, it closes the gates for some of these positive ones to come out. The negative chlorides now rush in, and now it takes us further away from threshold or more negative. And we see this same thing happening in these pictures here. So here's the full story. The pacemaker potentials or receptor cells, the intrinsic activity of the cell which occurs without external excitation. Transducer potentials across the membrane due to external events. These include generator potentials caused by receptors or synaptic potential changes arising at synapses. Both subtypes can be inhibitory and excitatory. As a consequence of transducer potentials, further responses will arise. If the magnitude does not exceed the threshold, the response will be non-propagating. If the response is enough, the nerve impulse or the action potential will be produced, which obeys the all or nothing law and proceeds unattenuated along the axon fiber. So we have one door closes, another door opens. Here we have the cell body. We have the presynaptic neuron. Calcium floods in, the neurotransmitter is released. Sodium enters the cell, and we have depolarization of the cell. The neural impulse goes down. Same thing on, I just wanted you to see from this one picture that we often see with the neurotransmitter release and how it looks, and we look at it from a longer chain of things. So here we have dendrites, we have some kind of mechanical or whatever stimulus onto the dendrites, processed through the cell body, starts at the axon hillock, flows down through saltatory conduction because we can see the little myelinated area, jumping from axon hillock to the terminal buds of the axon, synapses on another cell body's dendrites, goes through the process again, and here we have a polysynaptic transmission of electrical information. Here, before I use the terms temporal summation and spatial summation, this is a good definition of them. So if we have an action potential which allows you to summate somewhere around 2 milliseconds duration, which we saw in that other picture, we have postsynaptic potentials that are around 25 milliseconds in duration. That means there's plenty of time for a second action potential before a postsynaptic potential generates by the first action potential is over. So we're in that somewhere in between that 2 to 25 millisecond area. We can make use of the summation prior to the one we're trying to stimulate again. Temporal summation is successive excitatory postsynaptic potentials generated by the same presynaptic terminal. So if we look here, we have this one regular axon coming onto the dendrites, releasing its neurotransmitter, and it is almost reaching threshold, but is not. It's subthreshold, so no summation. Here we have this same one again, but it's now fired twice. So we have, it's fired, but at closer approximate times. So now this second depolarization is additive to the first, and we have the first little hump, and before it can get all the way down, we have another hump, and it reaches threshold, and we have all in an action potential. This second one is called spatial summation. This is where several presynaptic neurons fire simultaneously on the same postsynaptic neuron. So now we have 2 axons firing on the presynaptic dendrites, and we have an additive effect again, E1 plus E2, and we have that action potential. Here we have an excitatory postsynaptic potential and an inhibitory one. First, the inhibitory comes, it makes it more negative, and is now too negative for that excitatory one to reach threshold. and that is spatial summation of both different kinds, excitatory and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. Here again, we can look at it. Temporal summation is one source fired more rapidly, that has or rapidly enough at least, that has an additive effect to bump it up and reach threshold. Spatial summation is utilizing multiple areas to summate at the same time on the same one. So here we have a different look at things. We have a stimulus with a long interstimulus interval. We have a full repolarization back to resting membrane potential. There is no additive effect. Here we have only a 1 second, and then it's additive. My little guy says what happens at the amplitude if the interstimulus interval is placed at 500 milliseconds. So we cut this in half, and we would have the next stimulus starting here. And instead of letting it degrade almost all the way back down to resting membrane potential, this depolarization would start somewhere in the middle here on the hump and would probably reach threshold quicker. So I know a lot of people, when I go into the OR and I ask people, you're not getting great motors, let's troubleshoot. I see a lot of people do not mess with the interstimulus interval. And you can now see that that is a very gross mistake, not knowing how to effectively use that. Spatial summation, again, they're all additive. That's just 1 probe, 2 probes, 3 probes, 4 probes. The fourth one has the largest action potential there. Saltatory conduction, only in myelinated fibers. So we do not have this in the D fibers or the pain fibers. Myelin acts as an insulator and is formed around the axon in sheaths, in between which are gaps known as node or envir, where the membrane is exposed to the extracellular fluid and the voltage-gated channels are concentrated. The charge jumps between each node, allowing for the overall nerve conduction velocity to increase. It also conserves energy because the sodium-potassium pump must only work at the nodal area. So this is a efficiency creation by however you think it was created, but that's what it ends up being. We can see that we have this negative outside, positive inside, causing a depolarization across the membrane. This positive outside now starts to rush back over here, causing this negative to become more negative intracellularly, which causes it to flow in the unilateral direction as we stated before. But instead of going from each neighbor to each neighbor, it has this large jump, which decreases the amount of time spent propagating along that axon. So if you have more myelin, you have less capacitance and you have a higher velocity. So myelination will dramatically increase the speed of conduction because it decreases the capacitance, or capacitance is the ability to store a charge. The decreased capacitance will result in less charge having to be deposited on the membrane to produce a change in potential. In the unmyelinated axon, most of the current spread to regions close to the active zone because it exits the axon due to the high capacitance and leak conductance of that membrane. In myelinated fibers, on the other hand, the active zones are restricted to the axonal membranes exposed at the nodes. So like we said before, it's skipping from node to node. When you increase the axon diameter, you decrease the resistance and increase the velocity. So conduction speed is also dependent on the axial resistance through the interior of the fiber. The larger the diameter of this interior space, which is filled mostly with the axon, the lower the resistance for both unmyelinated and myelinated fibers. The diameter is typically helpful in figuring out the speed of conduction. So here's that little equation I spoke of before that will help you, could help you out in a pinch on a test. So if you remember that velocity equals 6 times the diameter of the nerve, then you should be able to figure out either the diameter of the nerve if you're given the velocity, or vice versa. So dependent on how they ask a question, remembering this equation could either work as a good backup to make sure that your memory is correct, or it could get you out of a situation where you can use this equation to figure out the velocity. Say if they gave you a large diameter afferent and they gave you the diameter. Speed of conduction. In the peripheral nervous system, the Schwann cell produces the myelin sheath. In the central nervous system, the myelin sheath is produced by the oligodendrocytes. Put that to memory. That is a classic neurophysiology question that could find its way on the CNIM as well. The conduction velocity of peripheral sensory and motor nerves typically range from 40 to 60. You saw another one that quoted 40 to 70. Or 4 to 6 centimeters per millisecond. The auditory nerve has an unusually low propagation velocity of about 20 meters per second or 2 centimeters per millisecond. What are the basic electrodes needed to record a biopotential? So that's a very difficult way of asking what we do on a daily basis. You need an active, a reference, and a ground. So an electrode is 1/2 of a battery. This gets a little bit heavy, but I'm going to highlight the things that you definitely need to know out of it. So electrolytes surrounding the metal assume a different electrical potential from the rest of the solution. This potential difference is called the half-cell potential. Two electrodes have a potential, with the voltage depending on the material. We want to use the same electrodes to reduce inter-electrode potentials, and we want to use inexpensive metals because this is a business that we're trying to make a profit on. So if you were, this is more people that do EEGs for long-term studies or anything like that might have a little bit more information given to them than people that find themselves straight into the neuromonitoring field. A lot of times it's because they're used to using these head electrodes, which we don't typically use in the OR. But if you have, say, a gold-plated EEG electrode as your FZ, and you use tin for your CP3, and then you use silver for your CP4, there is going to be a difference in the conduction of those metals, and you will have skewed results from your EEGs or SSEPs. So you want to make sure that you have the same material because it will have a same or similar enough inter-electrode potential. Now, if we look at some of these names, tin, pretty cheap. Silver, kind of expensive. Gold, really expensive. Platinum, very, very expensive. So when we look at what these are best known for, we'll see why the needles are made of what they are. So bias potentials result from exchange of metal ion and electrolyte in the absence of current flow. Electrodes with metal that do not cause a lot of drift of electrode potential and have some very long time constant is ideal. Silver chloride is best, and gold and platinum work well too. So out of those three, silver chloride is probably the one that you'll want to select on a test. That's the one that's most commonly used for the description right here. Gold and platinum, I've used gold as well. I think that's a common one for people in the EEG field to use. Platinum, not so much. It's just too expensive. The time that you might use platinum is if you're doing something straight on the brain because it protects against neurotoxicity. But again, price is definitely a factor there. Stainless steel is not the ideal metal to use, but that is one of the cheapest. So that is what our needle electrodes are made up of. Electrodes have resistance and capacitance. So before we saw resistance and capacitance used in our normal physiology, here we're seeing it in the electrodes. Surface electrodes are placed on the skin using electrolyte, which forms a layer of free chloride ions. Two layers of electrical charges are formed, one on the surface of the electrode and one of the opposite charge on the electrolyte. A similar situation is generated at the skin electrolyte junction. So we kind of have like a little sandwich going there. These double layer formations are equivalent to a charged capacitor. Thus, at the electrode electrolyte skin interface, or the sandwich there, a bias voltage develops as if there was a battery. It's imperative that the two electrodes of each recording channel be identical so that the voltages developed at this skin electrolyte interface are identical to the two electrodes. Two dissimilar electrodes will form a constant voltage difference at the amplifier input, which will cause a baseline drift in the output and distort the recorded signals. The purpose of the electrode is to act as a transducer between the ionic transport of the nerve and the electron flow in the wire. It is the junction between the electrode and the electrolyte that allows such a transduction to take place. The flow of ions and the electrolyte give rise to the flow of electrons or the current in the electrode due to an oxidation or reduction reaction occurring at the interface. So here's a picture of it. Here we have our electrode. We squeeze a little of that gel in there. Here's our skin and here's our subcutaneous layer. And this is our sandwich here of our different resistances that we hope have similar from one electrode to the next. One of the most common types of electrode is the sodium-sodium chloride electrode with an electrolyte containing chloride. So here's why this also becomes one of the more popular EEG cup electrode material is the sodium-sodium chloride used with the chloride gel. There are two properties that make it a good choice for an electrode. First, it is practically polarizable, meaning that current flows freely across the electrode junction. And second, it generates less than 10 microvolts of noise. So those are very good properties, and it is also not that expensive comparatively to some of the other ones. On to stimulating electrodes. So prior to the placement of an electrode, the related skin surface should be cleaned with alcohol or acetone in order to adequately reduce the electrode skin impedance. Anode and cathode should be 3 centimeters apart. If you place those too close together, you might not stimulate deep enough. If you place it too far apart, this can cause stim artifact due to current spread. The larger the surface area, the lower the impedance. This is why surface electrodes, around 78 millimeters squared, have lower impedance than even the needle electrodes, which is 20 millimeters squared. If the patient is awake, a lower impedance, large surface area, properly spaced anode cathode, and lower duration or pulse width of about 0.1 milliseconds will reduce pain so that data can be collected. So those are important to remember if your surgeon says we need to do awake baselines. Go ahead and do SSEPs before we put the patient asleep or we do intubation. At that point, you might want to turn down your pulse width a little bit. Make sure that you have a low impedance by really scrubbing their wrists and ankles to get that dead layer skin off, and use a larger stimulating pad if you had that option, and make sure you get that good 3 centimeters apart. When stimulating a nerve consisting of many fibers, increasing the stimulus intensity does not change the way an electrical stimulus activates an individual axon, but it affects the number of axons that become depolarized. So if we stimulate at 10 milliamps on a healthy person, we might get a small response. If we stimulate at 15, we do not get a better response because we stimulated those same axons better. It's because we recruited more axons that are probably more centrally located within the nerve. If we find maximal intensity to be 20, where we're stimulating all the axons, we may elect to do a 10% over that, or at 22 milliamps, to make sure that we're stimulating all axons appropriately without any kind of degradation. A negative current is excitatory because it causes the interior of the axons to become less negative, thus causing depolarization. This may sound paradoxical, but in fact, a negative electrical current flowing through the cross-section of a nerve fiber will cause the outside area of the nerve fiber to become more negative than the inside area. and the interior of the axon will become more positive or less negative than its outer surface, thus depolarization occurs. When a nerve is stimulated by placing two electrodes on the same nerve a small distance apart, the negative electrode, or your cathode, is the active stimulating electrode, and the positive, or anode, electrode may block propagation of nerve impulses, and that's called anodal blocking. So that depolarization will only propagate in one direction, namely away from the negative electrode. So if you're running an SSEP on the ulnar nerve, we place our cathode more proximal and our anode more distal. The cathode is our active electrode, and we want it to stimulate up the sensory fibers orthodromically, and we wanted to also block any antidromic through the sensory portion of the nerve, or orthodromic through the motor portion of the nerve, to reduce the twitching of the hand. That is called the anodal blocking. If we end up accidentally reversing those two electrodes, then we have our anode more proximal, blocking the cathodal or the distal cathodal information trying to go centrally. We could end up with a lower response. Stimulating electrodes. The median nerve, the cathode of the stimulating pair of electrodes, should be placed about 2 to 4 centimeters proximal to the wrist crease between the tendons of the palmaris longus and flexor carpi radialis muscle. Now, if you've done enough cases to sit for the CNIM, I guarantee everybody here can look at somebody's arm, stick some electrodes on there, and know that it's going to stimulate the median nerve. But for the CNIM test, you want to know about these measurement sizes, and you want to know about the tendons of the muscles that you're splitting. The anode electrode should be placed 2 to 3 centimeters distal to the cathode to avoid what is known as anode blocking, which we just went over. Similarly, for the ulnar nerve stimulation, the cathode electrode should be placed 2 to 4 centimeters proximal to the wrist crease on either side of the tendon of the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, and the anode should be placed 2 to 3 centimeters distal to the cathode. Other effective sites of stimulation in the upper extremity are the superficial radial nerve at the wrist and the ulnar nerve at the elbow. This is important because sometimes we will see people with amputations, or we'll see people with cast or other kind of injuries, or they have horrible polyneuropathies like diabetes or thyroid disorders, and you can stimulate the nerve anywhere along its path. It's always easiest to stimulate a nerve when it's most superficial. Now, if you look in the bicep, the ulnar nerve is more medial or more superficial compared to the median nerve. So if you were going to stimulate in the bicep, you could get a response from either median or ulnar. Chances are, without doing a sensory nerve action potential, you won't know, but chances are you're likely to summate the ulnar nerve since it is more superficial. You could always dive a needle down deeper or and kind of risk it a little bit, but I would not advise that. So if you look at the pictures below, the bottom left is the ulnar nerve, our typical location here at the crease of the wrist, and we can also stimulate before or after the elbow. If you have any kind of history of impingement syndrome, then you would want to go after or more proximal to the elbow. Here we look at the median nerve, our typical stimulation point in the biceps here, which is kind of difficult to achieve if you're using sticker electrodes. You can also stimulate higher up in the axilla. Again, you're probably most likely to get the ulnar nerve again. You could also stimulate up at Erb's point. Most likely going to get a lot of muscle movement where you do not want it, and the surgeon's going to complain about it. If we look at the radial nerve, the easiest way to stimulate it is in the forearm area here, where it's pretty superficial, but you can also come more proximal, especially if you're up by the deltoid in the tricep area, that little gap where the radial nerve runs. So there is no real standard of care, but here are some things that you should consider, especially because it was on the ASNM guidelines. The response elicited by the median nerve stimulation are mediated by several nerve roots, but primarily the C6 nerve root. This is a C6, so if you have a C6-7 case, you should make the argument that monitoring the median nerve might miss something. So you would elect to go a little bit lower and do the ulnar nerve. Overall, the median nerve will give you a more robust signal than the ulnar nerve. That is a general probability that that will happen. If you look at one of my posts in my 30 days of neuromonitoring, I'll show you some cases where the probability switches, especially when you have something like carpal tunnel and you want to look at the ulnar nerve to have a larger amplitude. The patient will have their, so if the patient has their shoulders taped, this may cause a problem in the upper plexus or nerve roots. The ulnar nerve goes through the C8-T1, which could miss an upper plexus lesion. However, since the median nerve goes through all those nerve roots, a C5 to T1, it might miss a lesion that involves only a few levels. Ulnar nerve is typically regarded as a more sensitive test for positional changes, but like I said there, you could make an argument that having the redundancy of an upper plexus monitoring mainly through C6 of the median nerve is warranted. Lower extremity SSEPs do travel through a more medial portion of the dorsal column, but it is a very small distance between that and the more lateral upper extremity tracts. There's no evidence that adding a lower extremity SSEP improves patient outcomes in ACDFs. So I think most of us are used to running uppers and lowers for an ACDF, you could make an argument that is unnecessary to run the lower extremity, especially since it's typically a worse modality with a lower success rate. You could also make the argument for having redundancy at such a small minimal charge to the patient. It's worth it. I personally have seen a cervical case go bad in the lowers with uppers intact. So it's possible, just something to think about. And then the reasoning the little guy came with, cover as much as I can within reason. I choose to monitor median and ulnar nerve for ACDFs. I just kind of took that from somewhere else. All right, if we look at the International 1020 system, this is definitely something you need to know. I remember a handful of questions coming from something that you can use this chart right here, or the pictures and these numeric values to help figure out. So you definitely got to know the nomenclature. So each side has a letter to identify the lobe and a number to identify the hemisphere location. So F is frontal, T is temporal, C is central, P is parietal, O is occipital. I think that's pretty straightforward. The one that might catch you is C, but central is pretty easy to remember too. Z is 0, refers to an electrode placed on the midline. So we use those all the time, CPZ, FPZ. That Z is just the central 0 line. When we look at the other numbers, the even numbers refer to the electrode position on the right side of the head. The odd numbers are on the left. If we see an A, that can mean an earlobe or auricular. A PG is a nasopharyngeal. An FP is a frontal polar. Sometimes we see CPC or CPI instead of CP3 or CP4. It's an easier way to discuss topics. We'll call it, the small c is contralateral, the small I is ipsilateral. CPZ is midway between CZ and CPZ, and CPZ is midline between CZ and PZ. So I think I skipped that other one real quick. So CPC is an actual landmark as well, but it is also referred to as just a general way of describing things. So if you were talking about stimulating on the left on this study and everything is always coming from the left, it's easier just to say the contralateral or ipsilateral side. All right, if we come back and look at our picture here, these might be new terms to you, the Nazi and Indian. They're just the locations in the very beginning of our measuring of our 1020 system. If you've never measured this, I would recommend going on YouTube or something and watching one of those instructional videos on how they go around measuring it. The 10 and 20 system is kind of a dead giveaway. It's either going to be 10% or 20% from each position to each position. If you're going to only half-ass memorize this stuff, I would memorize the 10%, which is also easy because it's out on the peripheral here where everything else is 10%. From there, all you have to do is memorize the locations, which you should be somewhat familiar with actually doing SSEPs and EEGs, that you should be able to just quickly add that up. So they might give you a head circumference and say what is the distance between CPZ and CP4, and you would just have to know that it's 20% of that number that they gave you. Bipolar versus referential. This is how we're going to set up our recording electrodes. So a bipolar electrode setup are very close together. They're used to subtract widespread far field potentials and record near field responses. So I'll show you in a later slide why that's important and what those, just by changing from a bipolar to referential montage, how it changes the recordings that we have. Bipolar is best for analyzing low to medium amplitude waveforms that are highly localized. So near field potentials are almost always localized to a certain area, and the closer you are to that generator area, the better your response will be, and it is not very forgiving if you are further away from that recording spot. Larger spatial gradients between the two will be recorded as a large response because large potential differences will be recorded. If both electrodes are far from the generator source, both electrodes will be recording current along isopotential lines with a low spatial gradient, and therefore a low amplitude response will be recorded. That just means if you're not close to it, you're not going to get a response. You'll be isoelectric. The referential montage has electrodes spaced far apart. This is used to record both near field and far field responses. Referential, when we're talking about SSEPs at least, will usually have some kind of active spine or active head electrode, and then it will be the opposite for the reference electrode. If you're recording over the spine, it'll be somewhere distant on the body. If you're recording off the head, they'll usually call it a non-cephalic reference, and that could either be your cervical electrode or your Erb's point, or even on the hand or even on the knee. There's less common mode rejection. So since we have such a large gap, the two electrodes do not see things as similar. So we don't reject a lot of the noise. So these referential montages, even though they'll pick up more real generator responses, they'll also pick up more noise because it's less capable of filtering those out. If the recording electrode is close to the generator, a second electrode that has a long distance away will act as an indifferent electrode and a high amplitude potential will be obtained. Increasing electrode distance also increases noise, especially muscle artifact, and may introduce additional generators. If the generator is proximal to the shoulder or hip, moving the reference electrode distally along the limb does not improve the signal. So here we have a bipolar versus referential, and while I'm at it, if you have a question on the CNIM where it just pops up a picture, usually they're notoriously known for having grainy pictures that are they're not going to take one from an up-to-date Cadwell or something from a Medtronic unit or something that we're used to seeing. It's going to be on some old clunky machine, probably like some 4-channel, and it's going to look like this. So be it EEG or Bears or whatever it might be, I always recommend looking first at the picture and just scrutinizing it, tearing it apart, and knowing what's on the screen before you even look at the question. So if I'm just looking at this here, I can see all these small far field potentials. I know they're far field because I know what the generators of them are. I see on the second one, it has more of an ISO potential, and it has a cortical recording. I see this response is coming in somewhere around N20 or 20 to 25, most likely looking at an upper extremity. If this was the lower extremity, then it would be looking at some kind of spine response, most likely having an electrode over the L2, or I'm sorry, the L4 spinous process and the iliac crest, looking at when the dorsal root entry zone happens with the conus equina, cauda equina. But here we see the N20 coming from our stim artifact, P4, so I know we're recording on the right side of the head. Since it's the upper extremity, I know we must be stimulating off the left side. I can't tell if it's median or ulnar nerve, but I know stimulating from the left, recording on the right, non-cephalic, referential, makes sense with all these far field potentials. Right side of the head active, another bipolar montage, makes sense that we have this isoelectric area not getting these far field potentials. And that kind of explains what this bipolar versus referential montage is. So this P9 is kind of early on in the distal brachial plexus. We have some other plexus all the way through the nerve roots, so we can look at the central, or not the central, but the conduction time of our most distal plexus to nerve root. And if we had some kind of lesion there, we could assess if there was some kind of prolongation in that area. What we don't have is a central conduction time on this picture. We would need a cervical response. So if we had our N13 right here, and we could compare that time between the peak of the N13 and N20, if that central conduction time was outside of normal limits, so we have an N13 going to N20, 7 milliseconds is probably the normal limits. If it was 13, then we might have some kind of demyelination or problem in the cervical area to the cortical area, and that's all we could tell from that. So how are waves generated anyway? This is one of the most basic questions that I'm not sure that most people even know how to answer. So here's what is currently accepted as the actual source of evoked potentials. Activity from a cluster of sensory neurons. So for example, the N13 cervical response has a larger amplitude from presynaptic activity in the dorsal column over the C5 area than the C2 spinous process segment. That means that this is a near field response with the active electrode over the sensory neuron. Now you might also have seen that you can get a large C2 cervical response, but that is a different response coming from the dorsal column as it comes into, if you're in the upper extremity, as it comes into the cunate nucleus. It is that postsynaptic activity at the C2 spinous process, which is also a near field generator, causing a large potential. And that's if you have your setup going from C2 to FPZ and or C5 to FPZ. But if you took your reference electrode and placed it on the hand, say, or a non-cephalic, you would be less likely to have any of those dorsal column, cunate nucleus, postsynaptic activity, but more likely to have some of that brachial plexus far field potentials that we saw in that previous slide. So if you had that active electrode over the C5, you would have a very large amplitude, but if you had it over C2, you would have a smaller amplitude because you would be further away from that generator point, which is the presynaptic activity in the dorsal horn. Number two, and I have a lot of that on my 30 days of neuromonitoring on my blog also. So if that was confusing, please go there and look a little bit further into that. Number two is synaptic activity between neurons. So for example, in visual evoked potentials, the P100 responses are from cortical activity from light stimulation. So this synaptic activity of neurons. The third is the action potential along an axon. So when we stimulate over the brachial plexus or the pop fossa or over the nerve at the elbow or anywhere else, you can move your electrode along the nerve and still get very similar responses in amplitude size with a different latency. And that's assuming that you are keeping your inter-electrode distance between the electrode and the nerve the same. So if you're recording over the elbow and then recording over the bicep, you probably won't get the same amplitude just because there's too much tissue in the way by the bicep. But if you were actually dissecting out the nerve and had an electrode directly on the nerve at the elbow and directly on the nerve at the bicep, you should have a similar amplitude in size, but the latency will be different. And that's called a traveling response. This traveling response is a good example of generating the potential along the nerve axon. And then you have non-neural events like a change in direction of a track or a change in the compartment that houses that neural structure. So for example, as the P14 upper extremity SSEP response comes from a change in direction after entering the foramen magnum. So this is a far field response that has multiple generator points. One of them is the cunate nucleus response. The other is this change in direction as the dorsal column crosses over and becomes the medial lemniscus. And then it has some other generators up into the brainstem. But one of those is this non-neural event, like a change in direction. And a fifth way is through what's called volume conduction or electrical current through the conduction through the body. So for example, wave 1 of the ABR is considered a near field response because even small changes in the distance from the auricular ipsilateral electrode in the CZ to auricular ipsilateral montage will decrease the amplitude. However, the CZ reference electrode is also active and gives off a far field potential at far distances. It has a larger spread or distribution. So wave 1 of ABR is classically known as a near field response, but it does also have far field response from this active CZ area that has a large distribution of activity. For the CNIM, if you ever are asked that question, don't go with what is the reality, go with what's best known. Choose a, wave 1 is a near field response. But in the real world, know that it is a mixture of the two, mostly near field though. So now let's better define this traveling versus stationary responses. So if we look at the little guy's arm on picture A, we see that we have a bunch of different recording electrodes along the arm, all the way from the elbow up to Erb's point. We cause a stimulation, and like I said before, because of different impedances of skin, we have changes in the amplitude size. It gets a little lower when we're going through that thick bicep, but it's very high when we're in the very superficial part near the elbow, as well as Erb's point. But for all intents and purposes, that's the same potential, and it is changing latency as it goes further along the nerve. So recording over an area of an action potential changes latency depending on the area recorded from. The time of the generator point is almost instantaneous because of the speed of conduction, so not much effect from other generators with bipolar montages. These are traveling potentials. Here we're looking at stationary potentials. When recording over an area where there is a change in the medium the nerve travels through, a synapse, a sharp change in direction, or a change in the size or conductivity of the pathway, a potential can be produced simultaneously at all recording electrodes during the time at which the generator is crossing the regions of the boundary with the differing properties. These appear at the same time with distance to the area of change affecting size of these signals. These are stationary potentials. So if we look at the cervical spine and we have these presynaptic dorsal horn activity with our N13 response, if we put our recording electrode at C6, C5, or C4, cervical areas, it will have the same exact latency, but we will probably have a difference in amplitude size because that is a near field response. As we move further away from the response, we get a smaller amplitude, but we have the same latency. So here I just went over my example. Cervical spine SSEP has both synchronous traveling potentials and stationary potentials in the groups of neurons that lie in the dorsal horn of the spine. The configuration depends on the location of the electrodes. So a C2 to FPZ, with the C2 being the active area, is over the dorsal column as it comes up to that cunate nucleus area. The C6 or C5 to FPZ is the dorsal horn interneurons. Whereas if you have a C5 FPZ, the largest has the largest amplitude, usually. And here is an example of these traveling responses. So if we have a source of electrical current coming past our recording source, we see as it comes closer to it, we have a more negative response coming. As it crosses over, we have that positive response, and as that leads back, it goes back down towards midline. Near field versus far field. Near field response, the source of generating the potential is near the recording electrode, which means it has a high spatial gradient, a high rate of change of potential from the other source of generator. There is a specific location that produces the largest amplitude. The size of the amplitude diminishes as the recording electrode increases in distance, more dependent on proper placement than far field potentials. Relatively reliable signals with larger amplitudes and better signal-to-noise ratios. So again, another example is our cortical channels for SSEPs. If you look at some of the studies, the chances of having the best amplitude is usually on the CP3 or CPZ area. Every once in a while, or not every once in a while, but in some population of people, it is better at the PZ or P3 or P4. It is almost never as good at the O3, O4, OZ, and rarely is it better at the CZ, C3, C4. So usually when we have people in the OR that are new to the field and they are getting poor SSEPs from a recording standpoint, it is usually because they're too far forward with their recording electrodes, and you just go up to the field and you push them back a little bit in the head over the correct CPZ or PZ area, and you all of a sudden have a larger response because those are cortical near field responses and you need to be as near field as possible. Below I have some of our near field responses that you should commit to memory because that is a very easy question to be asked and answered on the CNIM. So any peripheral nerve response is going to be a near field. So Erb's point, pop fossa, the ulnar nerve at the elbow, all those are going to be near field responses. Your N13 or 14 upper extremity SSEP, the P40 or P39 or P37, that's all the same response. It's just named differently because they have different latencies in different textbooks in their normative data, so don't be fooled by that. Here I called it P39, but you'll see elsewhere I call it P40. Those are also near field responses. So is the N20 for the upper extremity. Those are all cortical SSEP responses. And then wave 1 of your ABRs is that near field response. Far field responses. The source of generating the potential is not near the recording electrode or has a low spatial gradient. There is no set distance that makes potentials far field. So that's important to know, that just because the recording electrode is far away does not necessarily make it a far field. It's the kind of generator itself that causes it to be far field. It usually requires more filtering and increases the total number of traces collected due to a smaller amplitude and higher signal-to-noise ratio. Actually, a lower signal-to-noise ratio. So we'll go over that in a little bit, but the smaller the amplitude, the worse it is to collect, because noise just causes a lot of problems with it, and the more sweeps or traces we have to take to try to eliminate that. It's not always obtainable in healthy adults. Recording done in the electrical hostile environment of the OR makes collecting these even more difficult. So, I mean, if you think about, most people have a subcortical response from the lower extremities, and that is very hit or miss. And then when it does come in, it's usually pretty small in amplitude. Most far field potentials are positive and are higher frequency. Advantages, the information from many different areas of the nervous system can be attained from a signal recording montage. So like you saw in that one picture, we had that P9, P11, P13, P14. Those are all, like I said, positive responses, and they're all small responses, but we're able to pick up a bunch of them. And while not useful in the OR so much, if you're doing more diagnostic, those could be very useful in trying to figure out what's wrong. And the main disadvantage is the excess noise introduced by having such far inter-electrode recording distances. So far field potentials is your P14 of the upper extremity, the N18 of the upper extremity, those are obligate peaks. The P31 of the lower extremity, the N34 of the lower extremity, also obligate peaks. I should let you know that this is a good question here, is what is analogous to the P14 upper extremity SSEP from the lower extremity, and that is your P31. Just like the N18 is analogous to the N34. They're coming from the exact same generator source or area, but they're just coming from different nerves being stimulated. And then in our bears, we have wave 3 and wave 5, both far field responses. So white matter has both near field and far field potentials. So if we look at a referential montage, so we have all these recording electrodes up and down this guy's arm, and the first one on the left side, they put a recording electrode on the knee. So as we stimulate at the rest and we look at the first number 1 recording electrode, has a nice large amplitude N3. By the time we get up to 12, it is the latency is a much longer. It's going through all that muscle, so the amplitude is a little bit smaller. It's even really hard to get in the deltoid and chest area of 14 and 15. But that shows that it is a traveling nerve. But you can also look, since this is a referential area, we also are getting this N6 and N9. Those N6 and N9 most likely represent activity that happened further up in the arm, that it was able to be recorded because of this large interelectrode distance. But when we have a bipolar recording, so here they are referencing one electrode to the next, or 1 to 2, or 2 to 3, or 3 to 4, very similar to what we do on D-wave monitoring. We are able to get rid of some of these extraneous noise activity. So we still have this traveling nerve, the latency is increasing, but we are not picking up any of those far field potentials. So like I said, on the D-wave monitoring, if we can reference one electrode to a distant referential electrode. Sometimes we can do it to Erb's point or some other additional electrode we place in there on purpose. And you can record a D-wave, and sometimes that's a good way of recording it, especially if the bipolar recordings aren't working. But you are more likely to pick up a bunch of noise in the area, especially in the cervical area. You're going to pick up a lot of these vertebral muscles, or these spinal muscles, as those have a compound muscle action potential. We pick up that activity. So when you have a bipolar D-wave, you typically need less averages, but if you're doing a referential D-wave, then you typically need more just to average out the noise. All right, when it comes to near field and far field potentials, there is a difference in gray versus white matter when recording the potential over the skin. The white matter is typically thought of as action potentials causing the near field, while all other reasons cause far field potentials like synaptic activity, volume conductance, change in directions, or changing compartments. There are distinct differences in the productions of those waves. but this probably isn't the case for gray matter. Generation of evoked potentials from gray matter, as seen from the cerebral cortex, producing electroencephalographic and cortical evoked potential components, and the central gray matter of the cervical and lumbar spine, according to a bunch of those studies, probably come from the same mechanism. We still use near field and far field potentials as descriptive terms to identify the steepness in the change with electrode position, but not to describe how it was generated. So using these terms to describe evoked potentials from gray matter might not even be helpful. And this is just kind of an awareness thing, a nomenclature thing for you. So we need to know the guidelines for the upper extremity components. Try to fill in these numbers here, and we'll go on to the next section in the next video. But before you do, pause this video right here and then try to fill in those blanks. Okay, I'm assuming you paused the video, and the last one is, this is something I'm doing for free for everybody. It's for the IOM community in general, so please help out other people by helping awareness. One way is you can link up with me and or share this on LinkedIn. Just do a shared post on LinkedIn, or if you're going through the website itself, on the left-hand side, there's always that little LinkedIn tab. You can click that and share the post as well. This is just something to help out the community. So all I'm doing is asking in return that you also inform the community to bring better awareness for everybody, so we can all have a chance and hopefully get better pass rates on the CNIM and a better role feel in the operating room, so we have better patient outcomes as a whole. Because if we ever want to get paid, we need to have better post-out outcomes. So that is why I'm doing this for the communities. Better patient outcomes, more likely to get paid for what we're actually doing, better job security for everybody. So it's a win-win-win. All right, so that's it for this video, and we'll see you on the next one.